She was forced to serve tea to her mistress each night, but one summer Chloe stirred death into the porcelain cup. With each sip, her mistress drifted closer to the grave, never knowing her servant's vengeance was hidden in the brew. In 1802, Virginia, an enslaved woman named Chloe turned knowledge of herbs into a weapon of rebellion. Using the poisonous leaves of the oleander plant, she struck back against years of cruelty in one of the most chilling acts of silent resistance on the plantation. Before we begin, please subscribe to the Macabre Record for more dark tales pulled from history's shadows. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? The house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every small sound echo like thunder. Outside, the Virginia night hummed with insects, their wings droning in the darkness. Inside the kitchen, the only light came from the glow of the fire, its orange breath licking the soot-blackened bricks. Chloe moved carefully, every step measured, every breath controlled, as though the walls themselves might betray her. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, boiled water, and something else, something bitter and sweet, crushed between her fingers only moments before. In her hands was a simple cup, porcelain cracked along the rim, the kind her mistress favoured when she demanded her nightly tea. Tonight, that cup carried more than warmth. Tonight, it carried death. Her hands trembled as she stirred, though her face showed nothing. She had learned long ago the art of hiding herself, of letting her eyes drop and her mouth still, because any slip, any flicker of thought could bring pain. Yet now, as the steam curled upward, she felt her chest tighten, not with fear alone, but with the weight of everything that had led her here. Every insult, every slap, every order barked in contempt was steeped into this cup along with the oleander leaves. The fire popped behind her, a sharp crack like a pistol, and she flinched. For a moment she thought of turning back, of pouring the mixture into the ashes and retreating to her pallet like it had all been a wicked dream. But the thought of tomorrow, the same voice, the same lash of cruelty, the same unending servitude, hardened her. From the hallway above, a board creaked. Chloe froze, the wooden spoon resting against the cup's lip, her breath caught in her throat. For several heartbeats, she waited, listening. But no footsteps followed, no voice called out. Only silence, deeper now, like the house itself was holding its breath with her. She set the spoon aside. The tea was ready. She reached for the cup, its porcelain hot against her palm, and lifted it with deliberate slowness, as though the act of carrying it was already part of her confession. Each step toward the parlour stretched into eternity. Shadows of furniture loomed like sentinels in the dim light. In her mind, she saw her mistress's face, pale and proud, lips pursed in constant dissatisfaction. Soon, those lips would touch the rim of this cup. Soon that voice, sharp as a whip, might falter, then choke, then fall into silence. And as Chloe neared the threshold of the parlour, she realized there was no turning back. Tonight, history would take its first sip. The parlour glowed faintly with lamplight, shadows flickering along the wallpaper and across the heavy wooden furniture. Chloe entered without a sound, carrying the cup as though it were an offering, though in truth it was a weapon far sharper than any blade she could ever hope to hold. Her mistress reclined in a chair near the fire, the glow softening none of her features, only exaggerating the tight line of her mouth and the sharp tilt of her chin. She did not look up as Chloe approached. She never did. To her, Chloe was as invisible as the wood beneath her feet, useful only when serving, present only when summoned. Chloe's hands moved with practiced precision. She placed the cup on the small table beside her mistress, careful not to let it clink against the saucer. The steam curled upward, delicate and white, a soft veil of death rising unseen. "Your tea," Chloe murmured, her voice low, steady, stripped of anything that might betray the storm inside her. Her mistress gave the faintest nod, a flick of the eyes that dismissed Chloe even before her task was complete. The porcelain clicked against painted nails as the cup was lifted. Chloe stood a pace away, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, her face composed into the mask she had worn all her life. But inside her chest, her heart pounded with such ferocity she was certain it must shake the air. She watched the cup tilt, the amber liquid touch her mistress's lips. One sip, then another. The throat worked, swallowing. Chloe felt the seconds stretch into lifetimes. Would it take minutes, hours? Would the bitter edge of the oleander give her away before it could do its work? Her mistress smacked her lips faintly and frowned. "Too strong," she muttered, setting the cup back down after the third sip. Chloe's pulse roared in her ears. For an instant, she feared it was over, that suspicion would turn, that harsh eyes would narrow on her and demand an explanation she could never give. But the moment passed. The mistress reached for a book resting on her lap, settling deeper into her chair, her lips pursed in displeasure, but nothing more. The cup sat half-drained, steam still rising in slow spirals. Chloe lowered her gaze, stepping back into the edge of the room where shadows cloaked her. She did not allow herself to breathe relief. She simply waited, as she always had, her body still, her face unreadable, while deep inside a single thought echoed louder than the beating of her heart. The poison was inside her now. It was only a matter of time. Long before that cup of tea ever touched her mistress's lips, Chloe's fate had been sealed by the accident of her birth. She had entered the world not with the cry of freedom, but with the clank of chains already waiting for her. Born on the same plantation where she now stood, Chloe's first memories were not of warmth or safety, but of cold mornings in the slave quarters, of thin blankets shared with siblings who vanished one by one into the fields, sold away before their names were even allowed to take root in memory. Childhood, for Chloe, was not a season of play, but a lesson in silence. From the time she could walk, she was taught that every step belonged to someone else. Her hands were guided toward work before they had even finished learning to grasp. Her ears were filled with commands rather than lullabies. Her world was bound by fences, patrolled by men with whips and dogs, and the invisible wall of knowing there was no beyond, no elsewhere she could ever run to. Freedom was not simply forbidden, it was unthinkable. The children of the quarters grew up watching the older ones vanish, traded like cattle to other masters, their cries echoing for nights after the wagon wheels rolled away. Chloe learned early not to ask questions, because answers were a luxury for those who owned themselves. The house loomed large in her young mind, not as a place of shelter, but as a fortress of power. She saw it from afar at first, the white walls glaring against the fields, the windows shining like eyes that watched and judged. When she was chosen for house duty, it was spoken of almost as an honor among the quarters, but Chloe quickly understood it was no privilege. It was a cage with finer walls, one where the whip was replaced with constant scrutiny, where every mistake, every dropped plate or crooked bow brought punishment as sure as any lash. The mistress's tongue was sharper than leather, her disdain as painful as any strike. Chloe became a shadow within those walls, trained to move soundlessly, to speak only when spoken to become almost invisible in order to survive. And yet, within that enforced silence, something else was planted. She observed. She listened. She remembered. Every command, every insult, every slap across her cheek pressed down upon her, layering year after year of humiliation. But deep beneath the weight of that oppression, something hardened rather than broke. It was not hope. Hope was too fragile. It was resolve, slow and silent, waiting for its day. Working inside the house was a different kind of bondage, one that pressed closer to the skin than the whip. Field slaves carried scars across their backs and hands, their suffering laid bare beneath the sun. But house slaves endured wounds that cut deeper into the spirit, sharpened by proximity to their masters. Chloe lived within arm's reach of her oppressors, forced to serve their meals, clean their garments, and stand silently while insults fell upon her like ashes from a fire. The mistress in particular made cruelty her language. She would scold Chloe for the slightest imperfection, the shine of silver not bright enough, the hearth swept with one mote of ash left behind, the soup a shade too thin. And when the scolding was not enough, her hand would strike, quick and stinging, a reminder that even the smallest defiance would not be tolerated. This closeness made Chloe's servitude unbearable in ways the fields never could. The labor was constant, but it was the humiliation that dug the deepest wounds. To be forced to stand just behind the mistress's chair, pouring wine into her glass while listening to her gossip about Chloe's supposed stupidity, her lack of refinement, her inborn inferiority. To be called into the parlor when guests arrived, not to be seen as a human being, but to be paraded as property, evidence of wealth, an extension of the mistress's own status. Every smile, every polite nod Chloe offered was demanded, not given, and every time she lowered her eyes in submission, it burned like acid behind her ribs. In the quiet hours of the night, when her chores were done and her body ached with exhaustion, Chloe would lie awake on her thin straw mattress and feel the rage smouldering where no one else could see. The walls of the house that had once seemed so imposing now pressed closer and closer, like a coffin built around her. She was not allowed to speak freely, not allowed to rest when she wished, not allowed to belong to herself. She was expected to live as a shadow, always present, never acknowledged, her life reduced to service until death. That intimacy with cruelty, that daily suffocation, was more than chains could inflict. It was psychological torment, the slow erosion of identity. Yet Chloe's silence was not emptiness. It was a mask, carefully fitted, hiding the storm she carried within. Every insult was a spark, every slap a coal, every command a drop of oil feeding the quiet fire that grew behind her eyes. She would endure as she had always endured, but one day, she promised herself, she would not endure silently. The mistress's cruelty did not always come with shouting. Sometimes it was quieter, more deliberate, and those were the moments that cut deepest. She had a way of wielding her power not just through punishment, but through humiliation so sharp it stripped a person down to nothing. Chloe learned this lesson the night she was ordered to serve at a dinner with the plantation's guests, a gathering where laughter and candlelight filled the great hall while the enslaved moved silently in the background. Chloe carried the trays of food, refilled goblets of wine, and stood just behind her mistress's chair as conversation buzzed around her. But when the mistress noticed a small smudge of ash on Chloe's apron, barely visible in the dim light, she decided to make it her spectacle. She reached back suddenly, seizing Chloe by the wrist and yanking her forward so the guests could see. "Look at this," she sneered, tugging at the apron with her free hand, forcing Chloe to stand awkwardly before them. "Even the simplest task is too much for some." The guests chuckled, polite laughter at first, then crueler as the mistress's smile widened. Chloe kept her eyes down, her face burning, her hands trembling as she fought to hold back the tears threatening to rise. She had been taught since childhood that showing pain only invited more, and so she stood frozen, the laughter washing over her like acid. The mistress shoved her back into place, dismissing her with a flick of her hand as though she were nothing more than a badly trained animal. That night, when the dishes were cleared and the laughter had long faded into drunken snores, Chloe returned to the quarters with her humiliation still burning like fire on her skin. She lay on her pallet staring into the dark, her fists clenched so tight her nails broke the skin of her palms. The smudge of ash had been nothing, a speck that could have been brushed away in an instant, yet the mistress had turned it into a weapon, a reminder of Chloe's supposed worthlessness. It was not the first time such a thing had happened, but that night something shifted. The cruelty was no longer just a wound, it became a seed. The memory of the guests' laughter lingered in her ears, replaying again and again until it no longer made her tremble with shame, but with something sharper, something harder. For the first time, Chloe felt not just the sting of humiliation, but the quiet whisper of vengeance rising in her chest. The mistress had laughed at her as though Chloe were less than human. One day, Chloe swore that laugh would be silenced. Knowledge came to Chloe not in classrooms or books, but in whispers, in stolen moments, in the quiet exchanges of those who had nothing else to give but wisdom. The older women in the quarters carried with them the traditions of generations, fragments of healing practices brought across oceans and adapted to the harsh soil of the south. They taught the young how to soothe a fever with willow bark, how to ease a cough with honey and lemon, how to treat burns with poultices of mashed roots. Chloe listened more closely than most. She absorbed every word, every gesture, watching the careful way herbs were measured and blended, the reverence with which leaves were steeped into tea, the way certain plants were kept separate from the rest, guarded with a kind of unspoken fear. As she grew into her role in the house, Chloe's access to the kitchen garden expanded her learning. She tended basil, parsley, sage, and thyme, but she also learned which plants were never to be added to the pot. Foxglove, with its deceptively beautiful flowers, could stop a heart. Jimson weed, with its sprawling leaves, brought madness and delirium, and oleander, tall and green with clusters of pink or white blossoms, stood at the edge of the garden like a sentinel of death. Even a few leaves, the women said, could kill a grown man. Its beauty was its disguise, a plant that could be touched daily without suspicion, but carried death in its veins. The mistress had no interest in what the slaves knew or did not know. To her, Chloe was simply another pair of hands to be ordered about, another mouth to feed cheaply. She did not see the watchful eyes or the keen mind working quietly behind lowered lashes. Chloe learned not only how to cook and clean, but how to remember, to catalogue, to hold on to scraps of knowledge like treasure. She knew which herbs calmed the stomach, which stopped bleeding, which brought sleep, and which never to use unless one wished to see someone suffer. At night, as she worked alone in the kitchen, she would sometimes let her hand drift across the row of dried herbs hanging from the beams. Most were harmless, but every so often her fingers brushed the brittle leaves of something dangerous, and she would pause. Her mind would wander, not with childish curiosity, but with something darker. The same hands that prepared meals to sustain life could just as easily prepare something to end it. The thought was like a shadow passing across her heart. She did not act on it then, but the knowledge remained, coiled and waiting, a serpent in the garden. Among the enslaved, talk of poison was never spoken openly, never shared where ears could catch and twist it into rope around a neck. Yet in the quietest corners of the quarters, whispers sometimes rose like smoke. Stories passed from mouth to mouth of women who had slipped something bitter into the master's stew, of men who had stirred strange powders into coffee, of children too young to understand carrying handfuls of leaves that could bring even the strongest down. Most of these stories were fragments, half-believed tales of vengeance taken in silence, their truth impossible to prove, but their meaning heavy. They were not simply gossip, they were warnings and reminders that even the powerless carried shadows of power. Chloe listened, never asking questions, never drawing attention, but every tale planted itself in her mind. She noticed how the others spoke of these women with both fear and admiration, as if poison was both curse and blessing, both rebellion and doom. To strike in such a way was to risk not only one's own life, but the lives of all in the quarters, for masters rarely punished one alone. They believed guilt spread like fire and could be stamped out only by making examples. And yet, despite the danger, the whispers persisted. The very idea that a simple leaf, a root, a handful of crushed flowers could reduce a master to coughing, vomiting, writhing helpless on the floor, that idea carried a dangerous kind of hope. It meant that the scales were not fixed forever. It meant that even behind walls, without guns or freedom, one could strike a blow that could not be undone. Chloe did not speak of it, but the thought lingered whenever she worked in the garden, whenever her hands brushed against the smooth, glossy leaves of the oleander that grew in the hedges. To the mistress, oleander was simply decoration, a flourish of colour in the yard. To Chloe, it became something else entirely, a symbol of choice where no choice seemed possible. The plant stood tall, beautiful, unthreatening to those who did not know its secret. But Chloe knew. She knew the taste, the smell, the effect it could bring. and with every passing day, as the insults piled, as the humiliations deepened, she began to feel the plant calling to her in silence. Not yet, it seemed to whisper. But soon. The breaking point came not in a moment of rage, but in one of cold humiliation, the kind that sank into the skin and left a mark no lash could equal. It was a morning heavy with heat, the air thick with the smell of baking bread and sweat. Chloe had been up since before dawn, kneading dough, boiling water, scrubbing pots, her body aching with the endless rhythm of labor. When the mistress swept into the kitchen, her silken skirts whispering against the floor, Chloe straightened instantly, her eyes downcast. She had prepared the breakfast table with meticulous care, laying out the porcelain, the silver, the steaming biscuits, all exactly as demanded. But the mistress paused, frowned, and reached for a single spoon. There was a faint smear of grease along the handle, a mark so slight Chloe herself had not seen it in the lamplight. Yet, to the mistress, it was opportunity. She held the spoon aloft, her voice sharp and ringing through the kitchen. "Look at this filth," she said, as though Chloe had delivered an insult carved into metal. Without hesitation, she struck Chloe across the face with the back of her hand, the spoon still clenched between her fingers. The blow left a streak of grease across Chloe's cheek. The laughter of cruelty pressed into her skin. The sting was nothing compared to the sound of the mistress's voice, loud enough to draw others near. She berated Chloe for laziness, for stupidity, for her natural filth, each word falling heavier than the last. Chloe stood frozen, her hands clenching at her sides, her head bowed. She knew that one wrong glance, one flash of anger, could bring the whip or worse. So she held it in. She let the mistress's words wash over her, searing themselves into her memory. The humiliation was complete, not only because of the slap, but because others saw, because her shame was made a spectacle, because she was forced to swallow it whole without reply. That night, as she washed the dishes alone, her cheek still burning, Chloe's thoughts circled like vultures. The image of the oleander in the garden rose in her mind, its leaves green and glossy under the sun. She thought of the whispers she had heard, of stories told in low voices when the fire burned low, of women who had dared. She thought of the taste of tea, of steam curling in the air. And then, for the first time, her anger solidified into decision. She would not endure another slap. She would not bow her head forever. If her life could be taken at any whim, then she would make her own choice, to take one first. In the days that followed, Chloe carried her new resolve like a hidden ember, glowing in the pit of her chest. But with it came a fear that never loosened its grip. She knew what it meant to be caught. She had seen the aftermath of rebellion before, the broken backs, the fresh scars that healed only to be split open again, the bodies left hanging from trees as warnings. Resistance was never punished in silence. It was made into a spectacle, a theatre of pain to keep others docile. The masters understood fear as the strongest chain, and they wielded it without hesitation. Chloe's mind replayed these images at night when she closed her eyes. She imagined herself bound, dragged into the yard while others were forced to watch, her body laid bare beneath the lash. She saw the rope slipping around her neck, the sudden drop, the silence that followed. The thought alone made her breath come shallow, her hands slick with sweat, even as she folded laundry or swept the floor. Every time her gaze lingered on the oleander in the garden, she felt the dual weight of temptation and terror. She would walk past the bush slowly, pretending to check the herbs beside it, her fingers brushing the glossy leaves as though by accident. In those fleeting touches, she felt both power and doom. The plant was possibility, but also death, hers as much as her mistress's. If she failed, there would be no forgiveness, no second chance. The masters would not need evidence. A whisper of suspicion was enough to condemn. And yet, fear did not break her. It sharpened her instead. Chloe began to understand that terror was not only her burden, but her mistress's blind spot. The woman believed herself untouchable, safe behind walls and titles, never imagining that the same hands that poured her tea could seal her fate. That arrogance gave Chloe room to breathe, to plan, to imagine the unthinkable. The risk was unbearable, yes, but what was her life if not already a slow death? Each day bent beneath commands, each night spent aching, each insult swallowed whole until it rotted inside her. Was it truly life, or was it survival stretched thin like paper, ready to tear? She lived in the balance between dread and determination. One wrong move, and she would be crushed. One careful move, and the balance might shift. Fear pressed her down, but it also whispered the truth. Even the most fragile ember could set the world ablaze. The first test came quietly, in the stillness of an early morning when the household had not yet stirred. Chloe moved through the kitchen with her usual precision, but her hands carried a secret weight. In her apron pocket were a few leaves of oleander, plucked days before when no one was watching. She had dried them in secret, crushing them between stones until they became a coarse powder, pale and bitter. Now she held them wrapped in a scrap of cloth, her heart racing as she thought of what she was about to do. She knew the risk. Even the act of carrying those leaves could condemn her if anyone noticed, but knowledge without proof was not enough. She needed to see. She needed to know the poison would do what she had been told. On the edge of the yard, the pigs rooted in the soil, snorting softly in their endless search for scraps. Chloe approached the trough with her usual bucket of slop, but this time she carried more than leftovers. She slipped the powder into the bucket, stirred it with her hand, and poured it into the trough. For a moment she stood still, her breath caught, her eyes fixed on the animals as they devoured the mixture. At first, nothing happened. The pigs grunted and jostled, their bodies pressing against one another in their eagerness to eat. Doubt pricked at Chloe's chest. Had the stories been lies? Had she risked everything for nothing? But then the first pig stumbled, its snout rooting weakly at the air before it collapsed into the mud. Another followed, then another, their bodies twitching, their squeals sharp and short-lived. Chloe's stomach turned at the sight, but she did not look away. Her hands shook, her pulse raced, but her eyes held steady as she watched the poison work its way through flesh and bone. There was no mistaking it now. The oleander was death. She cleaned the bucket thoroughly, scrubbing until her hands were raw, and returned it to its place as though nothing had changed. But everything had. For the first time, Chloe felt the sharp edge of power in her own grasp, a weapon invisible, one that could slip past eyes and ears, one that could not be stopped once it entered the body. She carried the knowledge with her for days afterward, heavy and hot, a secret more dangerous than any whip or chain. And in that secret she felt something awaken that no master could ever crush, the certainty that she could strike back. The days that followed stretched into weeks, each one carrying Chloe further into a silence that weighed heavier than chains. The knowledge of what she had done, the pigs collapsing, their bodies jerking in the mud, burned inside her like a secret flame. She went about her duties as if nothing had changed, her hands scrubbing floors, polishing silver, kneading dough, yet every movement carried the memory of that moment. The power was real. The stories were true. She now possessed the means to turn years of humiliation into something final. But knowing and doing were not the same. Between them stood hesitation, sharp as a knife, cutting into her every thought. At night, she lay awake, staring into the dark, her mind circling the same questions. What if someone saw her gathering the leaves? What if the mistress noticed the taste, the bitterness in her cup? What if the poison failed, leaving only suspicion? She pictured herself dragged out into the yard, stripped, whipped until her skin was nothing but ribbons. She imagined the rope tightening around her neck, her legs kicking uselessly as the crowd watched in silence. Each vision made her body shiver, her breath catch in her throat. Fear was a shadow that never left her side. And yet, alongside the fear, came another image, one that grew clearer with each passing day. Her mistress silent, her sharp tongue stilled, her proud head bowed not in command, but in death. Chloe thought of the slap across her cheek, the laughter of the guests, the sting of every insult. She thought of the countless mornings rising before dawn, her body aching while her life was spent serving someone who saw her as less than human. Rage pulsed beneath her fear, steady, relentless. The poison had worked on the pigs. It would work on a woman. All that stood between Chloe and vengeance was the moment she chose to act. The opportunity did not come quickly. She waited, watching, careful to make no sudden move. She served meals, carried tea, scrubbed and swept as she always had, all while the thought gnawed at her. Sometimes she felt she could not bear the waiting another day. Other times she felt relief in the delay, grateful for one more night to live. But the balance could not last forever. She knew the moment would come, and when it did, hesitation would have to fall away. Every day she lived between two fates, death by her own risk or death by a lifetime of silence. One way or another, she would choose. The night she chose to act was no different from any other, at least on the surface. The household followed its usual rhythm, lamps dimmed, voices quieted, the mistress retreating to the parlour with her book and her demands. But for Chloe, every sound, every flicker of firelight felt magnified, as though the walls themselves knew what she carried inside her heart. The kitchen smelled of bread and smoke, but beneath it lay the sharper scent of crushed leaves she had hidden in her apron. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid them out on the table, but her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Tonight, she told herself, she would end it. She drew the water from the kettle, its steam rising in thick clouds, the hiss filling the silence of the room. Into it, she dropped the oleander leaves she had gathered days before, dried carefully in secret. Their edges curled and brittle. They sank into the boiling water, releasing their bitter essence, invisible and deadly. Chloe stirred slowly, the wooden spoon clicking against the side of the cup, her face expressionless, though her heart hammered like a drum in her chest. The sound of it seemed loud enough to betray her, yet the house remained still, unaware of what was being born in its kitchen. For a moment, she hesitated. The cup in front of her steamed like an altar, its contents shimmering with a power that could not be undone once delivered. She thought of the other slaves, their lives bound by fear, their whispers of rebellion hushed by the threat of punishment. She thought of the mistress's hand striking her cheek, of the laughter in the dining hall, of every insult carved into her spirit. She saw herself bent beneath endless labor until age stole her strength, her life discarded like so many others. And then she saw another vision. Her mistress silenced, her proud head drooping, her body weakened by each sip of this tea. Her hands steadied. The fear did not vanish, but it hardened into something else, something stronger. She lifted the cup carefully, the porcelain hot against her palms, and for an instant she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This was not merely tea. This was the sum of years of silence, transformed into action. She moved toward the door, each step slow, deliberate, as if walking toward judgment itself. Beyond the kitchen waited the mistress, unaware that her fate was already rising in curls of steam. The parlour was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of pages as the mistress leafed through her book. Chloe entered with measured steps, her eyes lowered, the cup of tea held steady in her hands, though her palms were slick with sweat. She set it down upon the small table beside the chair, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. Steam drifted upward in pale ribbons, curling in the lamplight. The mistress did not glance at Chloe, only gave the faintest gesture with her hand, a dismissal and a command all in one. Chloe retreated a half step, folding her hands before her apron. Her face was still, a mask polished by years of practice, but inside her chest her heart thudded so violently she feared it might be heard. The mistress reached for the cup, fingers delicate and precise, lifting it with the same careless grace with which she ordered Chloe about. Chloe's breath caught. Every detail of the moment seemed magnified, The gleam of firelight against porcelain, the way the liquid trembled at the cup's rim, the faint shadow of lips as they pressed against it. The first sip was small, almost dismissive. The mistress swallowed, set the cup down, and turned another page in her book. Chloe felt her knees weaken. Nothing happened. Seconds stretched, thick and heavy. Her mind raced with visions of failure, the mistress frowning at the taste, calling her forward, demanding to know what she had done. Her throat tightened until it hurt, but she forced her body to remain still. Then came the second sip, larger this time, followed by a faint smacking of lips. The mistress murmured something under her breath about bitterness, but reached again for the cup. Chloe's eyes flickered to the rising steam. It was inside her now. 3 swallows, 3 tiny steps into the unknown. Chloe could feel sweat sliding down her spine beneath her dress. The mistress shifted in her chair, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering within her own body. She took a final, careless swallow before setting the cup back with a sharp little sigh, as though unimpressed with the taste. Chloe did not move, did not breathe. The poison had entered her. Whether it would act quickly or take its time, Chloe could not know. But there was no undoing it now. History had tilted, and the first step towards silence had been taken. At first, nothing seemed different. The mistress sat in her chair, turning pages with the same measured rhythm, her lips pursed in their familiar line of dissatisfaction. But then, after several minutes, Chloe noticed the faintest change. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, her free hand moving to her stomach as though brushing away an invisible irritation. A slight cough followed, sharp but quickly dismissed. Chloe kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded tight before her, but inside her chest her heart surged with a mixture of terror and grim anticipation. The book slipped from the mistress's lap, falling with a dull thud against the carpet. She muttered, annoyed, but when she leaned to retrieve it, her movements were unsteady. Her fingers trembled on the spine. "Clumsy," she whispered, though her voice sounded different, strained, faint. She pressed a hand to her temple as if struck suddenly by a wave of heat. Chloe's throat tightened. It was happening. Within moments the small signs became harder to ignore. The mistress coughed again, this time deeper, her body curling slightly in her chair. She reached for the cup once more, perhaps to soothe her throat, and Chloe's breath caught. Another sip, another swallow. The poison sank deeper into her veins. The mistress grimaced, clutching at her side, her brows knitting together. "Fetch me water," she commanded weakly, her voice carrying less of its usual bite. Chloe obeyed, moving swiftly to the kitchen, though her legs felt like stone. She poured the water carefully, every second stretching unbearably long, before returning to place it on the table. The mistress took it with trembling hands, spilling some onto her dress as she drank. She coughed again, the sound harsher, ragged. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, sliding down her pale cheek. From the hallway came footsteps, the sound of another servant approaching. The mistress waved her hand sharply, though the motion lacked strength. "Leave me," she said, but her voice cracked mid-command. The servant lingered in the doorway, uncertain, eyes flicking to Chloe as though expecting explanation. Chloe kept her head bowed, silent, her face calm, despite the storm raging within her. Minutes passed, the fire crackling as the mistress shifted and coughed, her discomfort growing. She tried to rise from her chair but faltered, gripping the armrest for support. The air in the room thickened with unease. Something was wrong, and though no one dared say it aloud, the truth pressed against them all. The mistress was falling ill, and no one knew why, except Chloe. The hours that followed turned the household into a hive of anxious motion. The mistress's condition worsened with a speed that no one could explain. Her cough deepened, her face flushed with fever, and she clutched at her stomach with both hands, as though her insides were twisting themselves into knots. Servants hurried through the halls with bowls of water and cloths, their whispers sharp and urgent, while family members hovered in alarm. The mistress, who so often commanded the house with an iron tongue, now lay sprawled weakly across her bed, her voice faint and broken, calling for relief that never came. Word was sent for the doctor. Until his arrival, remedies were attempted, each more desperate than the last. Cool cloths were pressed to her forehead. Ginger tea was brewed and spooned past her lips, though most of it spilled down her chin as her hands shook. Chloe remained close, moving with practiced obedience, offering water, wiping the sweat from her mistress's brow. She worked with the same precision as always, her face unreadable, while inside her chest, her heart slammed against her ribs. Every time the mistress groaned, every time her body convulsed with pain, Chloe feared someone would look at her too closely, would sense the truth she carried in silence. When the doctor finally arrived, his presence filled the room with authority, though not with certainty. He examined her pulse, her breathing, her pallor. He muttered about gastric fever and bad air, offering explanations that did little to ease the dread that settled over the household. He prescribed simple treatments, rest, broth, herbal tonics, none of which touched the true cause of her decline. Chloe watched him carefully, her eyes lowered, her breath steady. Each wrong guess was another thread tightening around her mistress's throat. The family clung to the doctor's words, though panic seeped through their faces. The mistress, once so commanding, now whimpered like a child, begging for the pain to stop. Chloe dabbed her forehead with a cloth, her movements slow, careful, hiding the storm raging beneath her calm. In the corners of the room, the other slaves whispered nervously. They had seen sickness before, but this was different. It had come swiftly, unnaturally. Fear rippled through them, not only for the mistress, but for themselves. For in houses such as these, when something unexplained struck, punishment rarely stopped at the guilty. And Chloe knew, as she moved silently between bed and basin, that the longer her mistress suffered, the closer suspicion might creep. The sickness did not pass with the doctor's visit. Instead, it deepened, pulling the mistress further into weakness with every hour. By the second night she could no longer stand, her body racked with violent spasms that left her gasping for breath, her hands clawing at the sheets as though trying to tear the pain from her own flesh. The house was alive with movement, doors slamming, feet pounding across the floors, voices rising in panicked tones, but beneath it all was a quiet undercurrent of dread. In the quarters, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Slaves had long learned to read between the lines of sickness. Ordinary illness carried a certain rhythm, a slow decline marked by familiar signs. But this was different. Too sudden, too fierce. Whispers carried from one mouth to another, each one laced with fear. Some said it was a curse, others that it was punishment from God, still others that it was no accident at all. Eyes shifted in the dark, lingering too long, searching for answers that no one dared to speak aloud. Chloe felt those eyes sometimes, burning into her back as she passed in the halls, as though her silence carried a weight that others could sense. She held her mask tightly. Her hands remained steady when she poured water, her expression calm when she changed linens, her steps silent as she obeyed orders barked in desperation. But beneath the mask, terror gnawed at her. Each whisper she overheard in the quarters twisted around her like a noose. She knew it would not take much for suspicion to turn toward her. A single careless word from someone desperate to save themselves, and she would be dragged into the yard. Yet Chloe also felt something else stirring beneath the fear, something dangerous, something she dared not acknowledge aloud. A dark satisfaction. For every moan that tore from her mistress's lips, for every moment of helplessness where commands turned to pleas, Chloe felt the weight of years of cruelty shift, even if only for a moment. It was not triumph exactly, but it was power, however fleeting, and that made her heart pound in ways fear alone could not. Still, she knew power was fragile. One slip, one glance held too long, and it would all unravel. So she kept her silence, tighter than ever before, even as the whispers swelled around her, each one a reminder that her secret was a storm waiting to break. By the third day, the mistress was scarcely recognizable. Her once carefully powdered face now glistened with sweat, her hair matted against her temples, her body curled into itself as though trying to escape the agony inside. She moaned through the night, her voice rising into cries that echoed down the hallways, unsettling even the most hardened ears. The woman who had ruled the household with sharp commands now begged for mercy, her hands clutching at whoever passed near enough to reach. Chloe moved among the chaos with the same practiced quiet as always, carrying water, wringing cloths, wiping the sweat that poured from her mistress's skin. Outwardly, she was the picture of dutiful service. Inwardly, every moment felt like walking a blade's edge. The doctor returned, shaking his head as he spoke of infections, fevers, and unseen ailments. He prescribed more tonics, more rest, more fumbling remedies that did nothing to slow the mistress's decline. Her body betrayed her with each passing hour. Vomiting, trembling, a rattle in her chest that grew louder as her strength faded. Panic thickened in the household. Family members argued in sharp whispers about summoning another physician, about whether they should prepare for the worst. Servants hurried to and fro, their faces tight with fear, while in the quarters rumors churned into a storm. Some slaves prayed aloud for her recovery, knowing punishment would fall on them all if she died. Others fell into silence, their eyes lowering quickly whenever Chloe entered the room, as though the truth hovered unspoken in the air between them. For Chloe, each moment was agony and release combined. She felt terror in her bones, terror that someone would notice the bitterness in the tea, that another slave might betray her to save their own skin, that the doctor might stumble upon the truth by accident. Yet with every cry, every groan of pain, she felt the smallest ember of satisfaction flicker to life inside her. The mistress who had slapped her across the face, who had paraded her shame before strangers, who had treated her like less than dirt, she was reduced now to writhing in her own bed, powerless, pleading. Chloe never allowed that satisfaction to reach her eyes or her lips, but in the deepest part of herself it pulsed like a heartbeat. And still she knew the danger had only grown. The mistress was slipping closer to death, and with every hour the chance that suspicion would fall on her became greater. Vengeance was in her grasp, but so too was the gallows. It was only a matter of time before one would claim her. By the fourth night, the household no longer whispered about illness. They whispered about death. The mistress lay motionless for long stretches, her breath shallow, broken by sudden fits of coughing that left her lips blue at the edges. Her hands, once adorned with rings that flashed in the candlelight, now clawed weakly at the bedsheets, clutching them as though holding on to life itself. The doctor had returned twice, each time with less confidence, his eyes betraying the truth he dared not speak aloud. "She must rest," he said. "She must fight." But it was clear she had no strength left to fight with. The house seemed to bend around her suffering. Family members avoided one another in the halls, their voices sharp with blame. Servants rushed more quickly, their footsteps hurried, their faces pale with dread. In the quarters, prayers mingled with fear, voices rising in uncertain hope because they knew what her death could mean. Retribution rarely stopped at the guilty. The lash, the rope, the fire, all could fall upon the innocent if the masters chose to make an example. Chloe moved through it all like a ghost. She kept her composure steady, her face calm, her hands gentle as she dabbed the mistress's brow or held a cup to her lips. But inside her, something had shifted. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no undoing the tea, no erasing the leaves she had crushed, no stepping back into the safety of silence. She had chosen, and that choice now consumed every breath she took. Fear clung to her like a second skin. Each time another servant looked her way, she wondered if suspicion lingered behind their eyes. Each time the mistress cried out in agony, she feared it was her own name that would soon be shouted through the halls, but alongside the fear was a grim certainty. The poison was working. The end was near. She felt it in the heaviness of the air, in the way the lamps seemed to burn lower, in the silence that stretched longer between the mistress's gasps for breath. There was no turning back now. Whether she was discovered or not, Chloe's fate had been sealed the moment she carried that cup into the parlour. The mistress's life was ebbing away, and with it, Chloe's own would be forever marked. In that narrow space between vengeance and doom, she waited, her heart beating in rhythm with the slow unravelling of a life she had chosen to end. The mistress's decline could not be ignored any longer. By the 5th day, her voice was reduced to a faint rasp, her skin pale and clammy, her eyes rolling back in their sockets whenever the waves of pain overtook her. The doctor muttered helplessly of fevers and mysterious contagions, but his words rang hollow even to those desperate to believe them. A sickness this sudden, this merciless, was not natural, at least not to those who lived beneath the shadow of fear and superstition. And in such silence, suspicion began to coil. It started with a whisper, low and hurried in the quarters. Someone, perhaps in desperation, perhaps in terror, murmured that Chloe had been the one closest to the mistress when the illness struck. She had prepared the tea. She had been there at every turn. The words carried weight, heavier with each retelling. No one said it directly to her, not yet, but Chloe felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the sidelong glances that darted away too quickly, in the tightening of shoulders when she passed. Fear was contagious, and suspicion was its twin. Her heart pounded whenever she carried water or broth to the mistress's bedside, terrified that someone would speak aloud what they only dared to whisper. At night, she lay awake, listening to the shuffling and murmurs around her, certain she would feel a hand seize her shoulder at any moment, dragging her into the yard. The fear gnawed at her, but she did not falter. Her face remained steady, her voice quiet, her movements precise. To do anything else would invite the very suspicion she feared, and yet fear made others reckless. By the 6th night, one of the younger servants, his voice shaking, his eyes darting, murmured to a member of the family that perhaps it was no ordinary illness, that perhaps someone in the house had made it so. He did not speak Chloe's name, but the implication was clear. The words spread, winding their way up the halls until they reached ears that mattered. Suddenly, every eye in the household seemed sharper, more lingering when they turned toward her. Chloe felt the noose tightening, even before the rope had touched her neck. The mistress gasped and writhed on her bed, but it was Chloe who felt her own life beginning to slip. Vengeance had come, but so too had the shadow of exposure, looming closer with every breath. The moment came swiftly, like a door slamming shut on all the silence Chloe had carried. She was in the kitchen, her hands deep in a basin of water, scrubbing at linens that would never come clean, when the heavy tread of boots entered behind her. She did not turn at first. She knew that sound too well. The overseer's voice followed, sharp and cold, commanding her to stand. The water dripped from her fingers as she straightened, her eyes lowered, her breath trapped somewhere deep in her chest. 2 other men were with him, their faces set, their eyes fixed on her with the kind of suspicion that offered no escape. They asked no questions, offered no chance for explanation. Rough hands seized her arms, twisting them behind her back until pain shot through her shoulders. She did not cry out. She would not give them that. They dragged her through the house, past the wide-eyed servants who shrank against the walls, past the family members who whispered and shook their heads, past the doorway where her mistress lay dying, her body jerking weakly against the sheets. Chloe did not look toward the bed. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her steps heavy against the wooden boards, each one carrying her closer to the yard. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly, throwing every shadow into sharp relief. They shoved her forward, forcing her to stand before the assembled crowd. The slaves had been summoned, lined up in silence, their faces masks of fear. Chloe could feel their eyes upon her, searching for truth, for betrayal, for courage. The overseer's voice rang out, accusing her of poisoning the mistress, of daring to raise her hand, however invisible, against the house that owned her. His words sliced through the air, heavy with certainty. There would be no trial, no proof demanded, no weighing of evidence. In a world where her word meant nothing, suspicion was enough. Chloe kept her silence. Her lips did not part. Her eyes did not rise. Inside, her body trembled with terror, but outwardly she stood as she had always stood, in stillness, in submission. Yet this silence was different. It was no longer the silence of survival, but of defiance. They could accuse her, beat her, hang her, but they would never strip her of the choice she had already made. The tea had been brewed, the cup had been lifted, the poison had been swallowed. That truth lived inside her mistress now, and no rope, no lash, no executioner's hand could take it back. They wasted no time. Before the rope would claim her, they sought to break her body, to make her an example etched into the flesh of every soul who watched. The overseer barked orders, and Chloe was forced to the ground, her wrists bound tight with coarse rope that burned her skin raw. They dragged her to a post set deep in the yard, the same post where many had been tied before, where blood had soaked into the wood so often that it seemed to glisten even in the sun. She was lashed to it, her arms pulled high above her head, her body stretched so that every breath was a labor. The whip cracked through the air, its sound sharp enough to make even the bravest flinch. The first strike tore across her back, and though her lips parted in a gasp, she did not scream. Another blow followed, and another, each one searing her flesh until her dress clung wet against her skin. The crowd of slaves stood frozen, their eyes lowered, some trembling, some silently weeping. They had seen whippings before, but this was different. This was not discipline. This was theatre. Each strike was meant to carve fear into their hearts, to remind them that Chloe's act was not hers alone, but a crime that could fall upon them all. The overseer paused only when Chloe sagged against the ropes, her breath shallow, her body shaking. Still, she did not beg. She did not plead for mercy. Her silence unsettled them more than cries would have. For in that silence lay a defiance they could not beat out of her. She had already spoken her rebellion, not in words, but in action, and no amount of pain could erase it. Finally, when her back was a map of raw, bleeding stripes, they cut her loose. She fell to her knees, the dirt pressing into her wounds, her arms limp at her sides. The overseer gave the order, and she was hauled to her feet once more, her legs barely able to carry her weight. She was led toward the gallows hastily built at the edge of the yard, a crude structure that stood tall against the sky like a grim monument. The crowd followed in silence, their eyes wide, their steps heavy. Chloe did not resist. She walked forward with what strength remained, each step leaving a dark smear of blood on the ground, the path to her end already written beneath her feet. The gallows loomed ahead, rough wood hastily nailed together, its rope dangling like a serpent waiting for its prey. Chloe was forced up the steps, her body weak, her back searing from the lash, her dress clinging with sweat and blood. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Around the platform the crowd gathered in silence. Slaves pressed together in fearful clusters, overseers standing stiff with their arms folded, the master's family watching with grim, set faces. All eyes were fixed on her, but Chloe kept hers lowered, not from shame, but from resolve. She would not give them the sight of her fear. The rope was rough against her neck as they slipped it into place, the knot pulled tight against the side of her throat. She could feel the coarse fibers scrape her skin with every breath, each one shallower than the last. The overseer read her sentence aloud, declaring her guilty of poisoning her mistress, guilty of rebellion, guilty of daring to strike against the order of the world itself. His voice carried across the yard, ringing with the authority of law, but beneath it all was the unmistakable note of fear. For if Chloe could do this, then perhaps others could too. She did not speak. Her lips remained sealed, her silence more powerful than any words could have been. Some said later that her eyes lifted just once, sweeping over the crowd, and in that glance lay something that unsettled them, neither plea nor apology, but a quiet knowing. The signal was given. The trap beneath her feet opened, her body dropped. The rope snapped taut with a sound that made some flinch, others turn away. Her legs kicked briefly, a last struggle against the inevitable, then grew still. The crowd did not cheer. They did not cry out. a heavy silence fell, broken only by the creak of the rope as her body swayed in the hot wind. For the masters, it was meant as reassurance, a restoration of order. For the enslaved, it was a warning carved into flesh, a vision of what awaited anyone who dared to defy. But for some, those who had suffered the sharpest cruelties, who had whispered the darkest thoughts in the quiet of the night, it was something else. It was proof. Proof that even chains could not stop the will to strike back, even if it ended at the gallows. When Chloe's body was cut down from the rope, the overseers did not grant her dignity. They dragged her across the yard like discarded cloth, leaving a dark trail in the dust, and carried her away to be buried in an unmarked grave. No prayers were spoken, no words of mourning allowed. She was erased, even in death, stripped of the humanity she had dared to assert in life. For the masters, this was the point. Her body was not just destroyed, it was used. It became a message carved into every heart that had witnessed it. This is the price of defiance. In the days that followed, the mistress's death was spoken of in hushed tones inside the big house. Though her family lamented her suffering, their grief was quickly sharpened into fury. They spoke of Chloe not as a woman, but as a monster, a creature too dangerous to be allowed to live. The story was retold as a warning, passed to neighbors, spread from plantation to plantation. Each retelling twisted Chloe's act into something more savage, a tale meant to harden the resolve of the masters and deepen the terror of the enslaved. The slaves felt that terror keenly. In the quarters, silence fell heavy. Even the sound of children's laughter seemed muted, as though joy itself feared to rise. Whispers spoke of harsher punishments, stricter rules, closer watch. Everyone knew the weight of suspicion now hung heavier over them all. A single slip, a single rumor could bring lashes, chains, or worse. Chloe's name was rarely spoken aloud, as though saying it might invite the overseer's whip. Fear was a muzzle that pressed tightly over every mouth, and yet beneath that fear, something else stirred. In the quietest corners, when the lamps had burned low and the night wrapped the quarters in shadow, her story still lingered. Some spoke of it with dread, as a curse that had brought suffering upon them all, but others carried it differently, secretly, like a coal smouldering in the ashes. They remembered not the gallows, but the moment before, the tea, the sip, the mistress's decline. They remembered that Chloe, a woman with no freedom, no weapons, no power at all, had still found a way to strike back. The masters wanted her remembered only as an example of failure. But among the enslaved, even in fear, her act could not be wholly erased. In silence, in secrecy, her name lived on. Chloe's story did not exist in isolation. Across the South, across the islands of the Caribbean, across every place where slavery chained human beings into silence, poison had long been both a whispered terror and a hidden weapon. It was the rebellion of the powerless, the strike that could be carried in a handful of leaves, in a pinch of powder, in a cup of tea. Masters feared it deeply, even when they spoke of it with scorn, for it was the one form of defiance they could not always see coming. A runaway could be hunted, a rebellion could be crushed with guns and dogs, but poison slipped past locks and overseers alike. It was invisible until it was too late. In Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, planters recorded their fears of cooks and nurses, of women who handled their food and medicine. Tales of sudden sicknesses that swept through the master's table haunted the plantations, stories that mixed fear with superstition. Some spoke of obeah or voodoo, of charms and spirits tied to powders and roots. Others knew more plainly that the knowledge of plants, carried from Africa and passed down through generations, gave the enslaved tools of both healing and harm. The same hands that treated fevers in the quarters could, if pushed too far, turn that wisdom against the oppressor. In the American South, records of poisonings appear again and again, often buried beneath language meant to dismiss or distort them. Court documents tell of enslaved women accused of stirring arsenic into stews, of men accused of slipping powders into coffee. Sometimes entire families of masters fell ill in a single night, their sicknesses written off as spoiled meat or bad water. Sometimes suspicion pointed to a slave, and punishment followed swiftly, whether or not proof existed. But in every case, the fear remained. Chloe's act was part of this larger, hidden war. To the masters, it was savagery. A betrayal of the order they insisted was natural. To the enslaved, it was a reminder, dangerous, terrifying, but undeniable, that even the smallest act could shake the foundations of power. Poison required no army, no weapons, no escape routes. It only required patience, knowledge, and the courage to risk everything. The history books would rarely name these acts. They were often erased, dismissed as rumor or accident. But among the enslaved, the stories lived in whispers, passed from one generation to the next. And in those whispers, poison became not just a tool of death, but a symbol of resistance, quiet and unstoppable. The story of Chloe, like so many others, did not survive in ledgers or history books with her name preserved in ink. It lived in fragments, in whispers, in the uneasy recollections of those who had reason either to forget or to distort. Masters did not want their world remembered as fragile, their power shown to have cracks that could be split open by a single servant with knowledge of herbs. So when such stories were told, they were reshaped. The enslaved woman who poisoned became not a figure of vengeance, but a warning of savagery, a tale retold to justify harsher chains and crueler laws. Her humanity, her reasons, her suffering, all were stripped away, leaving only a caricature of danger. In court records, her name might have been replaced with a wench, a girl, or the property of. In plantation ledgers, her death might appear only as a note of lost labor, her execution not even worth the ink to describe. Where she lived, who she loved, what she thought, these were details erased by design. History written by the powerful had no interest in preserving the truths of the powerless, and so Chloe, like countless others, was swallowed by silence. But the silence was never complete. In the quarters, in hidden conversations, stories like hers lingered. Mothers warned daughters not just of the dangers of poison, but of the possibility it carried. Men spoke cautiously of the risks, reminding one another of how swiftly suspicion could destroy. These stories did not survive as triumphs, but as shadows, part warning, part inspiration, impossible to erase fully no matter how many ropes tightened around the necks of those who dared. Generations later, fragments surface, mentions in newspapers of mysterious illnesses, rumors recorded in journals, trial transcripts that only hint at the truth. They are glimpses, thin and distorted, but they tell us enough to know that Chloe's act was not singular. Her story was one among many, a note in the hidden symphony of defiance that history tried to bury. And yet, even now, when we try to piece together her tale, we are forced to confront the gaps, the deliberate erasures, the cruelty of a past that sought not only to enslave bodies, but to silence voices. Chloe's name, perhaps, is lost, but her act, the tea, the poison, the silence that followed, remains a story too sharp to be erased completely. Cruelty has a way of echoing, of taking root where it is sown. The lash leaves scars not only on the skin, but on the soul, and silence, when pressed long enough, grows sharp inside the heart. Chloe's act was not born from sudden malice. It was carved from years of humiliation, from nights of exhaustion, from the endless grind of servitude that reduced her life to labor and obedience. Every slap across her cheek, every insult hurled in front of strangers, every command barked as though she were an object, all of it gathered inside her like water behind a dam. When it finally broke, it did not break quietly. It spilled into the cup she carried into the parlor, into the tea that seemed so ordinary yet carried the weight of all her suffering. For the masters, her crime was proof of savagery, a justification for more chains, more fear, more violence. They could not see that the cruelty they inflicted had turned inward, reshaping itself into vengeance. They believed power flowed only one way, from whip to back, from master to slave. But Chloe's tea showed them a truth they feared. Cruelty begets cruelty. No system built on torment could expect obedience forever. Even silence, when forced for too long, could find its own language. Hers was the bitter taste of Oleander. Her story forces us to face an unsettling truth. When human beings are treated as less than human, when they are stripped of freedom, dignity, and hope, the will to strike back does not vanish. It mutates. It becomes quiet, patient, waiting for the smallest chance. And when that chance comes, it does not always take the form of rebellion shouted in the fields or escape through the forests. Sometimes it takes the shape of a steaming cup placed gently at a mistress's side, the kind of act so subtle it is almost invisible until the body begins to fail. Chloe's vengeance was cruel, yes, but it was also inevitable. It was the mirror held up to the world she lived in, a reflection of the cruelty she endured daily. In silencing her mistress, she revealed what slavery tried to hide, that beneath the masks of obedience lived rage, and that rage, once given form, could not be chained. In the end, Chloe's life was reduced to a single act, a single cup of tea carried across a room on an ordinary evening. Yet within that cup was the weight of centuries, of chains and lashes, of silence and humiliation, of generations forced to serve without hope of escape. History has tried to bury her, to strip her of a name, to remember only the rope around her neck and not the hand that struck her first. But if we look closely, we see more than a servant turned poisoner. We see the inevitable outcome of cruelty pressed too long against the human spirit. The image lingers, a quiet kitchen, firelight flickering on cracked porcelain, steam curling upward as bitter leaves steep. A woman stands alone, her hands trembling, her heart pounding, her choice already made. It is a scene both ordinary and extraordinary, a moment that could pass unnoticed until its consequences ripple outward in waves of pain, fear, and silence. In that moment, Chloe was no longer invisible. She was not simply the shadow behind her mistress's chair, the voice silenced in the parlor, the hands bound to endless work. For the first time, she held power, and she used it. Her act did not free her. It did not break the system that bound her or spare her the brutal spectacle of execution. But it forced those who witnessed it to confront a truth they wanted desperately to deny, that even within chains, resistance lived. Even within silence, there were thoughts that could not be crushed, and sometimes those thoughts found their way into action, quiet but devastating. The masters told her story as a warning. They spoke of her to inspire terror, to remind the enslaved that punishment would be merciless. Yet in the shadows, among the quarters, the story lived differently. It lived as a whisper that suffering had its limits, that vengeance could be brewed as easily as tea, that even those deemed powerless still carried the potential to strike. Chloe's name may be lost to time, but her act survives in memory's dark corners. It reminds us that history is not only written in ledgers and proclamations, but also in the unseen rebellions, the small acts of defiance that flickered like sparks in the night. And as long as her story is told, the silence she endured is broken. The cup she carried has not been emptied. Its steam still rises, curling into the long shadow of slavery, a bitter fragrance that lingers long after the last sip has been swallowed. If this story unsettled you, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record for more tales carved from history's darkest corners, and in the comments, let us know, where in the world are you listening from?